I'm sure the first thing you think of when you hear toll booth is the great inconvenience of your trip being interrupted to be charged a few bucks just to pass through. The mental image most of you might conjure is a clogged up freeway with lines of cars packed together, waiting to pay and move on. I can imagine the people who work at those booths find it even more boring than you do. The one I work at couldn't be further from the stereotype. The toll booth I operate is situated on a small country road that curves a few times along its path through the woods surrounding it, far away from any bustling highway. The booth itself is more like a little wooden shack, with chipped paint and an old sign that reads 25 cents, an amount I don't believe has changed sometime since the 50s. I guess that's when they decided to stop pretending it was a normal toll booth. Its only accessory is the barrier arm I can flip up or down. The interior is simple, with a single chain and a light on the ceiling, the only light besides the moon for miles. It only has one operator on any given night. Most nights, that's me. On the surface, it doesn't make sense why our local government would pay someone to sit out in the middle of nowhere to operate a booth that makes no money. And believe me, they pay well. But if you spent a single night out there, you would understand why. No, there isn't a sudden influx of 1,000 cars waiting to pay their tolls at 3 a.m. What we protect by keeping this booth running is worth far more money than any monetary cost can make up for. In my town, the job of operating the lonely booth is one that is highly respected and rarely spoken of. In fact, it's something of an unspoken rule that you keep private any conversations about the booth, the road, or anything related. Everyone around here knows there's something off about this place. Almost everyone has seen something they can't explain, or something they wish they hadn't. A lot of rural towns have their own urban legends. Most of the time, their residents embrace the myths, and I suspect it's because they all know it's a myth, save for a few crazies. Our town is the opposite. We keep quiet about the things we've seen. The most we can do around here is steer people clear of the road and hope nothing strays from it. The last thing we wanted was for the rest of the world to find out, and I suspect we're not the only ones. You see, our town is doing far better than most in our area. Our infrastructure never seems to crumble or degrade, our public schools are well funded, and no one is ever stuck looking for work. The reason this is noteworthy is that our town isn't exactly in the most prosperous region of America. This money is coming from somewhere, and it's not from our little property taxes. I've got a suspicion that the feds, or someone else, is dumping money into our town, and that they're keeping tabs on our little toll booth as well. I know this sounds ridiculous now, but once you get a better idea of my job and of recent events, I think you'll understand. As I said, the booth only has one operator each night, a tradition that goes as far back as we've been a town. Each week, we hold a private meeting at our town hall. At this meeting are all current toll booth attendants and any former ones who can make it. Most of the time, the meetings don't last longer than 15 minutes, but after the emergency meeting I called a few weeks ago, we've held them every day, and they've been taking a lot longer. The reason for which you will know soon enough. I suppose this is a good time to explain what happens at the toll booth and the road it sits on. You'll need to know my rules. Rule number 1. The booth does not need to be attended during the day. Not much happens at the booth when the sun is up, but the attendant for the night, which is usually me, must be at the booth an hour before sunset and stay an hour after sunrise. The attendant for the night is not to leave the booth at any time during their shift for any reason. Transportation isn't an issue, because either the sheriff or one of the deputies always gives us a ride to the booth at night and a ride back to town in the morning. Rule number 2. No cell phone, radio, or other electronic or communication device is allowed while operating the booth at night. The only thing running on electricity that a booth attendant is allowed to have is a flashlight. If you happen to bring a device accidentally, shut it off, store it inside the booth, and pray that it doesn't turn itself back on. Leaving it outside the booth isn't an option. Should your device turn itself on inside of the booth, your next best bet is to destroy it. This sounds like a drastic measure, but I've made this mistake before. I lasted about an hour before I couldn't take the screams coming from my phone and stomp it into oblivion. Haven't made the mistake of taking it with me again. I've never been told what the screams and other noises are, but I do know that past attendants have heard the same thing. Rule number 3. Rare as they are, cars may approach the gate at any time during the night. A common trait among those who end up on this road at night is confusion. The attendant's job is to decide whether they will be let through or turned away. The driver, along with the confusion, may express other emotions. They may be distressed, angry, paranoid, or fearful. Try to calm them down and put their minds at ease as best you can. Once you believe they're ready, you will simply ask them to pay their toll. One of two outcomes will occur. If the driver has no notable reaction, questions you, or hands you a regular quarter, you must leave the barrier arm down and turn them away. Do whatever is necessary to try and make them leave. If they threaten you or attempt to drive through anyway, you can let them know you'll be calling the police, even though you have no means of calling them. This scenario is unlikely because no modern navigation system would bring them down this road. All of the locals know not to use it, and it would be unusual for an outsider to learn about it. Though we have, on occasion, had to deal with a few lost travelers, most of them are compliant. Get them off the road as soon as possible, and direct them towards town where they can get their footing. Above all else, they cannot pass through the gate. But if you ask them to pay their toll, another outcome is possible. And unfortunately, the most common. They'll come to a sudden realization, as evidenced by their facial expression. It's as if they remember something, slowly reaching into their pocket and pulling out a black coin. They know they'll have to give it to you to pass. Some accept their fate graciously, others cry, but they all follow the road once the barrier arm is lifted. Around the corner, they drive, never to be seen again. In my first few months working here, I was confused as to who these people were. I wondered what it was they knew, how they got these coins in the first place, or what the coins were. All I knew was to leave it in the booth to be picked up by the next shift. This was until I happened to be watching the local news one morning after I got home. They talked about a man who was killed in a car accident the night before and showed a picture of him. A face I had seen only hours before, puzzled and afraid, as he asked me where he was and what was going on. When I asked him for his toll, he froze, slowly reached into his coat pocket with a quivering hand, and pulled out a black coin before placing it in mine. He gripped the steering wheel and faced forward, knowing he had to pass through and drive around the corner. He knew where he was going. Sitting in my living room that morning, recounting the events of the last hours, I noticed that I was the last person to see that man. He was already dead, just passing through, as were the dozens I had seen before, and the countless more I knew I would see. It was the moment I realized the road was some kind of path to somewhere beyond. As for this rule, I don't believe anyone has ever stopped the dead from passing when their time has come. I don't think anyone ever could. It's something so surreal that, in the moment, all you can do is let autopilot take over and continue with your duties as you were told. But as for letting the living through, I'm afraid it has been done before. A few decades back, a visitor from out of town was passing through the town. Back then, he didn't have a phone to give him directions, so he had to go off of a map. Even with a map, I'm certain he didn't know of the road because it was never put on one. My best guess is that he happened to see it and figured it could be some sort of shortcut. When he approached the gate, he was, of course, turned away by the toll booth attendant, but he wasn't taking no for an answer. The man got violent with the attendant, pushing him over and raising the arm himself before driving through. This hadn't happened before, at least as far as any of the past attendants at the booth who were still alive could recollect. No one was sure what would happen next. Back then, they only knew the rules, not the consequences, but they didn't have to wait long to find out. The next night, the same man in the same car rolled up to the booth. When asked for his toll, this time he presented a black coin. He seemed to have lost his memory of the night before, only knowing that he needed to pass through but not why. This has continued every night for the last several decades. Each night he pulls up, confused as to why he's here and needs a pass, and forgetting each time. Each night he gives us a coin, and each time he passes on, driving around the bend into the woods, not seen until the next night. He never ages, and his appearance never changes. Sometimes, he even says the same exact thing as the night before. Other times, he expresses a sense that he's been here before, and that everything feels familiar, like he almost remembers sometimes. His fate is one I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemies. Dead, but not being allowed to move on, and never remembering why you're there, living the same moment night after night until who knows when. His story is one that reminds me of the importance of our job here, but not the only one. Rule number 4. At some random point in the night, you may hear something moving through the trees, something big. Sometimes they emerge from the woods, other times they'll be coming down the road. Try not to be afraid. No harm is coming your way, quite the opposite. But I can see how this would be hard to believe. In any case, you need to raise the arm and let them through. I remember the first time I saw them. I heard a clop somewhere down the road, coming towards the booth like a horse galloping. I rose to my feet and grabbed my flashlight, intrigued. I remember hoping it wasn't someone's horse. I had never been told what to do in that scenario. When I did point my flashlight at the road, I nearly had a heart attack at the sight before me. A bull moose was approaching with a brisk walk. Of course, I was warned of this, but the details I was given were vague. All I was told was that a moose might approach the gate, and I was supposed to let it through. I wasn't told that this thing stands around 9 or 10 feet at the shoulder, or that its fur is so dark I couldn't see it without my flashlight, save for the massive antlers, which are white as snow in contrast. The only other part of his body clearly visible from afar were its eyes, which shone with a small speck of white light, glowing in the dark. I screamed and retreated to my booth, tempted to run off into the night and abandon my post. Fortunately, the moose slowed its pace and eventually stopped in front of the barrier arm. This calmed me down, and I slowly raised it, watching as the moose approached to pass. As it did, I noticed the halter and reins on his head. I followed them up, only to meet another set of eyes, identical to the moose's, towering over me. Again, I yelled, but contained my volume when I realized whoever or whatever this was on top of the moose was making eye contact with me as they passed. This figure was dark, if not darker than the moose it rode on. Something akin to a shadow. Just like everyone in their cars, they walked down the road, beyond the bend and out of sight. I had to sit down for half an hour before I stopped shaking. Needless to say, I wasn't very happy those finer details had been left out. Only after my shift and expressing my frustration was I told more. Apparently this hunter and his moose have been around for a long time. So long that no attendant alive today can remember a time without them. Some believe they've been here for the past couple hundred years or more, possibly as long as the strange road and the booth have been around. What we do know is that they aren't bound to the road like the others. At our town hall, we possess a written account of the hunter and his mount riding right through the town in the middle of the night back in 1919. And to this day, a few residents have seen the moose while they're driving at night. You may be wondering why I refer to the figure on the moose's back as the hunter. Well, that's what us attendants call him. Every so often, he and his moose will arrive at the booth, dragging a corpse behind them. When I say corpse, I don't mean an animal or even a human for that matter. I mean abominations out of your wildest nightmares. Things that send a shiver down your spine and make you want to vomit at the same time. The things you would expect to find talked about in a religious text when the end of days comes. The hunter drags these things down the road and around the curve. I can't be certain of anything, but if you ask me, he's taking them back to some sort of afterlife or underworld. Maybe it's the same place the dead go when they drive around the curve, or maybe somewhere in the road is a pathway to many different places. I couldn't tell you. What I believe, like the other attendants and anyone who knows about the hunter and his moose, is that they're here to protect us. Whatever these things are that he's taking with him aren't supposed to be here in the first place, and he's just here to set things right. Now, this is where we get to the point, why I'm telling you about all of this. I explained before that the people from my town like to keep these things quiet. And for the most part, I agree. I'm not a fan of airing our business to the outside world. It's attention we don't need. Unfortunately, I don't think we have a choice this time. It began a couple of weeks ago, during one of my shifts at the booth. Everything was going well for the most part. No new dead passed through that night, nor did any living try. The only customer I had was our regular, poor old bastard, confused as ever. After him, all was quiet for a few hours, until I heard a slow clop coming down the road yet again. These days, I'm not afraid anymore. I've seen the hunter and his moose enough times that I don't fear either of them, and like I said, I've come to respect them for the things they take out of this world. The one thing I often fear is the sight of whatever it is they're dragging out. That night was no exception. They approached the gate and stopped in front of it. Before I moved to raise the barrier arm, I shone my flashlight at the rope being dragged behind, and the dreadful thing attached. The end of the rope was tied in a knot around an enormous pair of cloven hooves. Hooves that belonged to what looked like the lower half of some sort of deer. As I moved up the body with my flashlight, I quickly discovered that this wasn't just some massive buck. The legs may have been reminiscent of one, but the upper body was that of a man in a striped red and blue clown suit. The sleeves were shredded at the wrist, and protruding from them were long, blackened hands with claws for fingers. The head was by far the most grotesque part. Its nose and mouth, like the rest of its head, were covered in the skin like that of a pale man, but their shape was that of a deer's. Blood dripped out of its half-open mouth. The ears were similar, with the same pale color and texture as a man's, but shaped like a deer's again. It was like someone took human ears and stretched them out, morphing them to fit the disgusting shape they desired. On top sat a red and blue jester hat, and a set of antlers sprouting out above them. I froze for a moment upon seeing the entity of this beast, but snapped out of it when I reminded myself that I had a job to do, and that I had better do it if I didn't want to see this thing any longer. I walked over to the barrier arm and raised it. The moose resumed its trot forward along the road and past the gate. As they passed me, I couldn't help but watch the deer clown monster it was dragging behind. A streak of blood followed on the road behind it. Right before it passed the booth completely, I lit up its face with my flashlight to get a final look. Its eyelids shot open, revealing the black and brown eyes underneath. Then it opened its mouth and let out a loud, pain-filled bleat before it leaned down and clawed at the knot with its hooves. In only a few seconds, the ropes were cut and the beast attempted to stand. It didn't get far in its initial attempt because the bull moose in front of it struck its head with a powerful kick. Another splash of blood came from the clown's mouth along with one of its teeth as it fell back to the ground, seemingly knocked out for a moment. While it recovered, the hunter turned his moose around to face it head-on. I ran from the booth and hid behind a tree to the side of the road but kept an eye on the fight. Air shot from the moose's nostrils as it began to grunt. His grunts were louder and deeper than the bleats of the deer clown. I could feel my chest vibrate with each powerful grunt. The clown finally stood and stared back at the hunter and moose, letting a few more bleats out as if to challenge them. At its standing height, this thing was taller than the moose, though it was obvious the moose was much larger and heavier overall. The moose lowered its head and charged. Before it connected, the clown thing attempted to claw at the hunter on its back but failed. It was picked up off the ground by the moose's antlers and driven through a row of trees that came crashing down on top of it. The moose backed up a step and turned, allowing the hunter to throw a new rope around the clown's head. The moose charged away with the hunter holding the new rope. They began to drag the clown by the neck, I assume hoping to finally make it around the bend this time. Unfortunately, it was still conscious and sliced the rope with its claws again. The clown didn't waste any time, hurrying to its hooves and charging into the woods. The hunter on his moose followed. In only a moment, they were both out of sight. I only noticed my heavy breathing after all was quiet again. It took me an hour to work up the courage to leave the tree line and return to my booth. When I did, I noticed the tooth from the clown lying on the road and collected it. Fortunately for me, the rest of my shift was uneventful. Unfortunately, the hunter never returned with the clown. When the sheriff picked me up at sunrise, I told him to hurry to the town hall for an emergency meeting. During the drive, I contacted everyone else and told them to get there as soon as possible. At the meeting, I presented the tooth and gave an account of what I had just witnessed. There was a mix of emotions. None of the other attendants had ever seen something escape from the hunter before, and no one knew what it meant. The agreed-upon action was to wait at least a week. It's unusual to not see the hunter and his moose for more than a week, so we figured he would catch the clown in the next couple of days and all would be sorted. I dearly wish that was what happened. A day later, a video surfaced on the internet from the town over. It showed a pair of deer antlers sticking out above the tops of trees as the man recording was driving. A few days after that, another video. This one was recorded by a woman who awoke in the middle of the night to laughter outside. Halfway through the video, you can see the antlers and part of the hat outside of a second-story window. The woman recording didn't notice, but commenters on the video sure did. Last week, someone halfway across the state uploaded a grainy photo of a black moose on a hill in a clearing between the trees far off in the distance. These are just the ones I've seen. Now, you can see why we've been having meetings every week. I can tell you we're not the only ones in a panic either. Strangers started showing up around town, and not the kind that are just passing through. They try their best to fit in, but they stick out like a sore thumb. The dead giveaway is when they show up to our bars and diners, striking up a conversation before asking folk what they've seen around here lately, and asking about the booth and the strange road. In the last week or so, they've stopped trying so hard to hide it. Black government SUVs have been crowding the parking spaces downtown. We kept the tooth in the town hall, along with every other document and record we have about the booth, and now it's all missing. It's clear that whatever happened that night wasn't supposed to, and we weren't the only ones who noticed. I didn't work last night, but the attendant who did had a lot to report this morning in our meeting. The feds drove out to the booth and took a look around. He pleaded with them not to drive through, but in response, they told him they already knew why they shouldn't. Something we weren't expecting. It's only a matter of time before they come for me. I suppose I'll tell them the truth when the time comes. As much as we like to keep it a secret in our town, the genie is out of the bottle. I figured I'd at least tell all of you before the feds. Every one of you should know what's out there. As for me, I'll keep watching the booth at night, and sticking to my duties is about all I can do. Still, I'll be keeping up with all of the developments that I can. I can only guess based on the posts I've strung together, but it looks like the clown is still on the move, and our hunter close behind. I can only pray that he catches it soon. In the meantime, if you hear strange laughter in your backyard at night, stay inside. Hey everybody, Nightmares Nightly here. Thank you all for listening, and remember, if you come across a toll booth in a windy country road, don't forget the rules.